One of the things I actually enjoy about traveling is the surprising things that I learn while I'm there. And that's what this is, the first episode of Surprises While Traveling. And this is actually inspired by a woman who just told me that her favorite foods are escargot and oysters. My first thought about that is how incredibly expensive those are normally. But when I went to France last year, I discovered that you can eat them in France for next to nothing. One of the surprising things about going to northern Bretagne was all the free seafood. Bretagne is and Normandy are famous for having an exceptionally long tide. Where then the tide goes out, it exposes a large swath of land that was once underwater until the tide disappears. And I'm not sure exactly the extent of the tide differential, but because it's so gently sloped, it goes out for miles. This is what made Normandy a great place to land on the beach, is because it meant there was a beach that they could get up to, and then when the tide went out, stuff would be sitting there. Um, and then they could get close to it during high tide, and because it was tidal, there would be differentials in the depth of the water. In Britannia, it means all the free seafood that you want. So I'm staying in a town called Saint-Jacques-sur-la-Mer, which is in northern Britannia, about halfway between. I can't remember the name of the cathedral. We went to Mont Saint Michel and Brest at the far end of Britannia on the northern shore there, and it's on this peninsula that sticks out into the ocean like this. And so we went out to the end, and at high tide there's a couple of islands. And at low tide you can walk to them, or there's a couple of people who live there who then you can tell they drive during low tide between the two because there's tire marks there. But when the tide goes out, the population all goes out too. Everyone is out there clamming and oystering, and they're basically digging up for free their dinner. So if you live in northern France and Bretagne, and especially, you can, because I didn't see this in Normandy when the tide went out anywhere near as I did in Bretagne. Um, there is all this free shellfish available, and they're everywhere. The birds are eating them, the people are eating them. I saw people shucking oysters right there and just slurping them right down because until a few minutes before they were covered with brine and they are perfectly safe to eat. It also helps that it's a really clean part of France. I'm not saying that France is dirty in particular, but I'm saying that because the water is clean, and there's no oil there, no oil drilling there, that there's nothing in the water to contaminate the food. So you have all these razor clams. I know were really big, and oysters were really big, and people were out there, just collecting them and taking them home in buckets, like spades. Whereas usually you'd have to pay through the nose and teeth to get this kind of food. Where if you're not doing anything anyway at night, you can just go out there and basically have dinner for free. All the seafood that you can eat because the tide will take several hours to turn. So it's do you want to eat it there, or do you want to collect it and then take it home and then eat it once the tide has come back in? And it means that the sea keeps it fresh every day. So the sea is basically your refrigerator or your pantry, and all the seafood that you want is right there. I think that's one of the reasons why certain places are as populated as they are, is because in antiquity there were places where you could get a lot of food. I know when I went to Barcelona in Spain, it was originally settled by the Romans for only two reasons: one for wine, and two for fish. And those were its two number one imports. And Roman wine is different from modern wine, but they would chop up the fish and into this salty preserve, and that was a huge staple of the Roman diet, particularly in the Mediterranean. Is because it was the way they were preserving it was more or less as close as they could get to canning tuna like we do now. And I don't know what kind of fish they were using, but they were gutting it right there and then shipping it and then preserving it and then shipping it right out. And if you go look at the old Roman Wall is really far from the shore, and that's because in between the city and the shore was where all of this fish processing was going on. All the fish were getting gutted, and then I think just inside the walls where they were brining it, and then they were shipping it out. And that way, it gave them a smelly place outside the city that was also pretty breezy, so it didn't make the city stink. Barcelona was never a really big Roman settlement, but it was occupied by soldiers for a really long time because of the fishing, because it was an important food source. So it's interesting to see in antiquity, or even in modernity, the relationship between people and food. and that if you go to France and you want oysters, going to Bretagne means you can have almost all you can eat for the price of going to Bretagne. And it's not necessarily cheap. It was $100 ticket to go from Paris to Saint-Malo, which is on the other side of the inlet there. Saint-Malo, Dinard, and then Saint-Jacques-de-la-Mer are the major towns along the northern coast of France. Major towns. Saint-Malo is a major town, big fortress city. But Dinard is the fishing village on the other side of the inlet, and then Saint-Jacques is on this little peninsula, like I said, that sticks out into the ocean. So these are all prime fishing opportunities. And you can see that in modernity, people stay there because the cost of living is low, because you can basically eat for free from the sea every day if you have to. That as long as you're making enough money to pay all of your other bills, food does not have to cost you an arm and a leg, and you can eat food that's much, much more expensive for the average person if you're willing to just go out every night and harvest it yourself. And so food has been a major driver of human population centers and settlements all throughout time and history. And this is something that I found very interesting, because often you ask yourself, why is there a city here? And in some places, it's because it's near fresh water, transportation, or resources. Those are the major historical reasons for having settlements where they are. So then you look at Las Vegas, where I am now, and there's absolutely no reason to have a city this big here, except for in modernity, we don't have to rely on the ability to feed everyone from the surrounding area. It was originally settled, and there were like 5,000 people in this whole valley, ranchers and everything, because that was all the water and the food would support. And now we have over 2 million people who live here because we can move food in. In antiquity, this would have never been a major city in any way, shape, or form. There would have never been a college or university here of any size, because it quite simply would not have been gastronomically important. And so the refrigeration has really changed human settlement and changed settlements from where there's resources to where there's some other way to make yourself rich without having to worry about feeding yourself. But if you are interested in oysters and escargot, well, there's plenty of that in northern France for free in the fields and streams and ocean. But for normal people, oysters are pretty damn pricey. I didn't have to pay a lot of money to eat in northern France because basically they would go out and catch it every day. It was wild. So they would go out fishing, and we would go sightseeing, and then they would feed me free food. It was great. So I had stuff I never would have otherwise eaten because I'm just too much of a cheapskate to pay for it. So food has been a really interesting thing, and how people continue to feed themselves today. And that was probably one of the more interesting things about it. Even when we got invited over on Sunday night for dinner, we had a whole bunch of fish, and the sun had caught them that day. So it was free food. We catch them, you buy them, and different types of fish, so we could try a lot of variation. And it did mean there was variation in your diet, assuming you like fish. Some people don't. Some people hate seafood. As for me, I'm on a seafood diet. Seafood, I eat it, and you can tell. Anyway, that's it for today's episode of Things I Didn't Expect to Discover on Vacation. Take care. Travel safely.